Minutes after 4 p.m. Central African time. It is a Thursday afternoon, and you know exactly what that means. Come this hour and time on this day, Ashraf Garda of the National Pulse on SFM and myself, Tammy Ngubeni, host of Africa in Business on Channel Africa, hold hands, a team together to make sure that all of Africa knows exactly what is going on as far as the G20 is concerned. We do know that it is monumental for the continent. For the first time, the G20 going to be held on African soil, South Africa being the host come November. Now, the Women20 South Africa Summit did take place earlier this week, and they were very specific about urging G20 leaders to prioritize policies that are promoting entrepreneurship, financial inclusion, as well as access to education and healthcare for both women and children around the world. And Ashraf, I'm sure you'll agree with me that this is a struggle that continues to intensify and a struggle that still continues the voices of men, women, and advocates around the globe.
Absolutely. Good to connect with you as always, Tommy. Yes, I think there's this huge drive for, economic advancement, well, for all people in the world, but specifically for women. And the Women20 engagement group, in this case, is advanced gender equality and women's economic empowerment. In this case, offering this platform for diverse women to advocate for relevant policies and programs. The question is how?
The question is how, and we've got just the person to unpack this for us this afternoon. We're joined by one of the speakers at the summit, the founder and CEO of Crtve Development, Dr. Okito Wedi. A very good afternoon to you, Doctor. Welcome.
Afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, good to connect with you as well, Dr. Okito. So let me start with this first up, right? Maybe it's been asked 50 times, but we have to ask it again. What for you would be the biggest challenge, or the biggest challenges in this case, in plural form, faced by women as a result of not having, gender-focused policies? Because you find often enough there's an absence of being very intentional about gender empowerment.
Absolutely. And thank you for starting us off on a really pertinent question, which I love to answer, by the way. I think policies essentially that don't account for gender are inadvertently built to fail because inequality is built into the design, right? So women still carry most unpaid work. They earn less, and they often work in the informal sector, informal jobs without the protection and benefits that, they require. So this often means less income, less safety, less time to actually grow and sustain a business or any kind of career for that fact. So when you design a policy that assumes that everyone is essentially starting on the same level, what you will find is that women often fall through the cracks of that. So the challenge here really isn't about capability. The challenge here is access. And to fix this, we need to design economies that actually serve the people who move and run those economies, move those economies forward. And women are a staple to that. So this is essentially what you find when gender is not a factor or a leading factor in terms of how policy is negotiated, designed, and implemented.
Dr. Wedi, as you mentioned this, it just comes to mind that this is a mammoth task that you are embarking on. It's literally taking the triangle or the pyramid and turning it upside down, because you're talking about a reworking of the genesis and the skeleton of these policies. But to be more specific, what are the type of policy measures that you are proposing for the G20 governments to put in place in order to support those women that you talk about, those women in the informal sector? I'm talking about women entrepreneurs, and especially women who are living in lower income countries.
So I would propose three things to start with, right? Essentially, and hopefully I can go through this in the most simple way as possible. One, make it easier to trade, right? So let's cut the red tape. Simplify registrations and tax for micro and small firms, make public procurement work for women enterprises. The second thing I would propose is really open up finance, right? So lower collateral requirements needed for particularly people within informal economies to start businesses, right? Guarantee small loans, support digital payments so that women could actually operate safely and independently. And the third thing that I would propose or recommend is make it possible for women to actually work, right? And it sounds almost ridiculous, but it's important when you think about the investments needed around childcare, paid caregiving leave, safe mobility so that women could actually trade and scale. So if you think about, the G20 backing the Johannesburg goals, which is essentially the 35% shift in jobs, pay, and care by 2035, this should be more than just verbiage, right? We actually need the funding and the appropriate and adequate funding to support the goal so that women entrepreneurs are essentially able to grow and have the kind of time and capital needed to actualize in the way that they want to, that they desperately need to as entrepreneurs in a particular context and space such as this. So those would be my immediate recommendations around this issue.
All right, let's talk about the care economy, and maybe you can explain what that is. But there's a sense that came out of the summit is that this care economy is neglected. So, A, do you agree with that? And if so, how do we turn that from neglect to genuine benefit?
So the care economy is definitely neglected. It's ironic because care work is essentially the foundation of every economy. So if you think about teachers, nurses, domestic workers, housewives, right? If they were to stop for a single day, everything else would stop with them. So the problem here is that we still treat care or care work and care sectors as if it's charity, volunteering work, as opposed to labor that drives productivity, right? So this is essentially what needs to change. And creative development, our belief is culture comes first, policy and systems follow. So we need to essentially start telling stories and better narratives to make the critical nature of care work much more visible to the public and key stakeholders at large. And then the policies and the kind of investments that need to support the policies must follow. And so this would be budgets for childcare. We're thinking about fair wages. We're thinking about protection for domestic workers. And then after that, we need to track these things. So we need to be able to track care in the same way that we're able to track energy and infrastructure and transport. So when governments are able to fund care work, when businesses are able to operationalize and think about care within their operation system, so proper time off, care leave, etc. And when society begins to see care and care workers as skilled labor, we will get to a point where we're not just talking about women being recognized, but we can move the conversation onto women being paid and paid adequately for the work that they do within society. And this is where economies will grow and will grow much more fairer, much more resilient.
I mean, as you mentioned all of that, Doctor, I'm just thinking, when you look at care work, it benefits not only the women, it benefits the men, the children, and indeed the entire community and society. So in as much as this may be advocated by the W20, it is an all of society approach that will actually benefit from this. But post the G20 presidency of South Africa, how do you hope the propositions that you've put in place, as well as all the various interventions, will continue to evolve and remain relevant and effective?
Thank you for that question. I think as the G20 presidency moves from South Africa to the USA, I think the task for all of us is to ensure that the agenda set, the agenda that we've built here, doesn't lose momentum or meaning, right? And so what this fundamentally means is that the Johannesburg goals needs to be incorporated within the economic track and not just the gender track, right? Which would fundamentally mean that there's annual reporting around these jobs, around pay, around care work, around safety, and that this is incorporated as part of the G20 finance and labor work streams, right? As opposed to just the gender track. It would mean aligning on development finance, where we're thinking about institutions such as like the African Development Bank or the World Bank, and the sort of prioritized investment that needs to be made around care infrastructure, women enterprises, as well as safety systems. This would be critical. And again, not just having this seen as the kind of side project that people need to do to be able to meet the KPIs at the end of the year and get the money out, right? And then finally, incorporating culture into the mix the entire time. So storytelling, public dialogues, ensuring that not just youth, but men are brought into the conversation as well, and not just with the framework or the perceptions in which we've engaged men in anything gender related in the past, right? So I think this is how you keep the W20 alive beyond a single presidency, by essentially turning the goals into a public mandate, right? So that it's not just limited to a moment.
Yeah, Tommy, you want to say more?
No, I'm just, wanting to exclaim the fact that indeed getting the women's issues and women's economy out of women's issues and into mainstream economic issues is so important because of the impact that women's contribution makes to global GDPs. And if those gaps are closed, how much more of an impact women would then be able to make.
And I'm hoping people will respond to that as well. I'll tell you what, Tommy, we can talk about it all afternoon. I know that. I much appreciate your time. However, Dr. Okito Wedi, who's the CEO of Crtve Development, and I think those points are important about public participation, and that last point about actually men has to be central to the issue, the issue around women empowerment and that the agency that they may have around just that. So thank you for your time, Dr. Wedi. Much appreciate you connecting with us here on, SAFM and Channel Africa in the countdown to G20.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Doctor. That's Dr. Okito Wedi. Always a pleasure, Ashraf Garda. Looking forward to our conversation again next week when we focus on more G20 issues. Thank you, Doctor. You have a great one. And that's how we come to the end of our G20 feature for today. I mean, one thing about Ashraf is that closing this gender employment and pay gaps could boost GDP records, say, by around 5 to 6% in developed and emerging markets. And then in other emerging markets, it goes as high as 10 to 13%. So these conversations being so critical, not just for women, but for global economic stability and progress as well.
G20.